Welcome to the Daily Technology Pulse podcast by Daily Computers, your expert technology partners for public and private sector organizations throughout Maryland and Virginia. This episode is brought to you by Panasonic Connect and Eclypsium, keeping the public safe and the network of safety officials strong and trusted. And now your host, Rick from Daily.
Joining us today on the Technology Pulse, we have Sean Georgia. He's the Professional Services Territory Account Manager for Panasonic Connect, and Wes Dobry, Global Director of Sales Engineering for Eclypsium. Thank you so much both for joining the podcast.
Hi, Rick.
Hey, Rick. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And so we are continuing to talk about CJIS, and especially the CJIS security policy. For those of you who have not listened to the episode where we spoke to absolute security, please go ahead and listen to that, but only after you finish this episode, because we're going to be talking with Wes and Sean about Eclypsium solution. So Sean and Wes, let's have you introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how you are pertaining to the topic of the day, which is the CJIS security policy. Sean, you go ahead first.
No, thanks, Rick. I appreciate you having me on your show today. And so my background is that I'm with Panasonic Connect representing professional services. And I'm with Panasonic for a little bit over 2.5 years at this point. Panasonic had the ability to recruit me away from my former position, and that is I spent 26 years with the Pennsylvania State Police. And Rick, I'll tell you, I had a fantastic career with them. It was a wonderful experience, and I had many opportunities to delve into both the operational aspect of policing as well as the technological aspect of policing. The last 8 years of my career, I spent working in our Bureau of Communications and Information Services, ultimately retiring as the director of the Bureau, having achieved the rank of major, something I'm very proud of as well. But within the Bureau, we had administrative control over all of the operational technology utilized by our troopers across the Commonwealth. That included our Panasonic CF31 mobile office devices. We had about 1,900 of those in our patrol cars, as well as our records management system, our dispatching function, computer-aided dispatching, and an area of criminal justice that's known as the CJIS security policy. The CJIS security policy is promulgated by the FBI, and I'll explain how that matters after Wes introduces himself.
I'm Wes Dobry. I run our sales engineering team over here at Eclypsium. And a little bit about my background is I've spent the last 25 years leading teams that help advise organizations on really what the latest threat vectors are into their organizations and how to protect against them. So I ultimately focus to evangelize about what's the most dangerous components and dangerous ways into organizations and how to protect against those.
Well, again, we are certainly glad that you are willing to share your knowledge with our listeners today. And I know this is a really important topic for law enforcement when we're talking about this CJIS security policy. So, Sean, go ahead and fill us in on just what exactly that is.
No, thank you for the opportunity. So the CJIS security policy is a policy that's promulgated by the FBI CJIS Security Division. And CJIS stands for Criminal Justice Information Services. The policy, though, however, is created by an entity called the Advisory Policy Board, APB for short. The APB is composed of law enforcement professionals represented from all of the 50 states in the various territories, as well as representative entities such as the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Major County Sheriffs Association. The APB provides recommendations to the FBI CJIS Security Division about what should be contained in the security policy. Now, the FBI will then publish the security policy under the director of the FBI's name and signature. Why does this matter? The CJIS security policy is a policy that all criminal justice agencies, as well as non-criminal justice agencies who utilize criminal justice information that is derived from a federal source. in my experience in policing, Rick, that most of the criminal justice information utilized by all law enforcement at both the municipal, state, and federal level has a nexus to a federal source, meaning that the CJIS security policy applies to just about all of the information that a criminal justice agency has to utilize to be successful. So what the CJIS security policy does is it creates a set of controls and best practices that agencies have to follow to ensure that criminal justice information is always secure, whether it's in rest or in transit. And it applies to any device, such as a Panasonic CF31 that I used to use in my last agency, or network appliance that either views, stores, processes, or transmits criminal justice information. And so, just as I'm talking to you now, I have a copy of the policy open on my desktop, and I can tell you that currently, in its form right now, it is 451 pages long, not including appendices. So it is a very complex and comprehensive document that all criminal justice agencies have to follow.
Wow, that is absolutely huge. And, I imagine that's not weekend reading. I imagine that's something that you need to do over a good amount of time. Now, let me ask this. How often do law enforcement agencies have issues with that policy?
Well, having issues is complicated. So, all law enforcement agencies in the United States are audited by what's known as the CJIS Systems Agency. So, the CJIS Systems Agency is an agency designated within each state that is responsible for the implementation of the CJIS security policy and to ensure that all law enforcement agencies or criminal justice agencies are following the policy. How that's done is through the use of audits. And so the CJIS Systems Agency will audit every criminal justice agency on a periodic basis to ensure that they're following all of the requirements of the CJIS security policy. My agency, the Pennsylvania State Police, specifically the Bureau of Communications and Information Services, of which I'm involved or was involved, is the CJIS security agency for the state of Pennsylvania. Now, I was not known as the CJIS systems officer, which is the ultimate employee responsible for managing of the implementation of the policy. However, the CSO and the ISO, the information security officer, both worked with me over the course of 8 years, and together we implemented the policy throughout Pennsylvania. So that formed the baseline of my knowledge on this topic.
And then do agencies actually fail CJIS audits? Because again, with a policy that's 450 pages, I have to think that there are going to be issues that come up from time to time, but is it just a warning system, or is it you've had this issue, you need to correct it immediately?
Yeah, the latter statement is more to point. And so when an audit occurs, there are times when there would be an audit finding. And the audit finding is a formal notice to the agency that some area of their implementation of the CJIS security policy is out of compliance with the policy. Now, with an audit finding, it is imperative that the criminal justice agency then take corrective measures to fix whatever the finding was. And that agency then has to report back to both the CJIS Systems Agency, the FBI CJIS Division, as well as the APB that I discussed earlier, on how they're going to mitigate those findings and come into a corrective stance. Although it's rare, extremely rare, the FBI does reserve the right to terminate an agency's direct access to CJIS systems if they refuse to come into compliance with the policy.
Wow. And I imagine that has to be really daunting. Obviously, this is something that has been going on for a while, but if you get somebody who's new into an organization, or somebody who changes over and starts working in a new role, it's one of those areas where you, like you said, you didn't have to be the expert on it, but I imagine you had to be fairly well versed, and then there were people within your organization who needed to be the experts. This is the type of scenario where we always say it sounds really daunting, but this is where we always like to say, but we think we have a solution.
Yeah, no, it's extremely challenging, Rick. You're absolutely right. So every agency, according to policy, is supposed to have a position that's called the local agency security officer, LASSO for short. So that LASSO is required at the agency level to implement the CJIS security policy. Now, in my time here with Panasonic, and before that, my time with the Pennsylvania State Police, I found that agencies of all sizes, from small, medium to even our large, most progressive agencies, oftentimes aren't keeping abreast with the most recent changes and requirements of the CJIS security policy. And so here at Panasonic, we've taken an advisory role that when we notice an area in the security policy that we can advise agencies of, and we'll use a new requirement as an example, we try to do so because we have an astute client base that we want to succeed in their mission. We want our clients to be successful. And part of that success is ensuring that they're complying with all components of the CJIS security policy.
I understand that Panasonic Connect also has a smart compliance service, and Wes, this is where we're going to bring you into the conversation. This smart compliance service is powered by Eclypsium, and I understand that we can't say it's an easy button that you press, but you're trying to make it easier for these law enforcement agencies to stay compliant, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And when we think of just CJIS compliance policy and as a whole, as Sean was kind of mentioning there, is that it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole where it's always chasing, what the latest settings and the controls are, and you're running on a fixed budget of people, time, and money on how you can solve these challenges. And one of the very interesting components of the latest CJIS policy that was just released is they've actually started to assign priorities to things. Namely, the specific controls that now have deadlines for applications of these specific controls. Now, where we come into play is that these controls are generally a technical challenge, and doing things like monitoring for vulnerabilities and monitoring for baseline changes in devices and validating the integrity of the device, for example. And in those scenarios, these oftentimes incredibly difficult to manage at scale controls are the things that we at Eclypsium focus on. And what we've ultimately done is built a platform to allow these CJIS agencies to monitor devices efficiently and operationally and continuously at scale, and map that back to these CJIS controls. And that way we can easily highlight where an organization needs to spend their time and focus on the areas where they can actually do meaningful change with how they can implement their CJIS controls.
So, Sean, this is obviously a very high priority when it comes to the CJIS security policy. So, when did this start to come into play for law enforcement agencies?
No, that's a great question, Rick. And let me add some color here, if you don't mind. And that is, I had the extreme pleasure of attending the FBI National Academy. And the FBI National Academy is a national academy the FBI puts on for law enforcement professionals from across the world. It's limited to only the top 1% of law enforcement professionals. And it has coursework that's accredited through the University of Virginia. And so while I was at the FBI Academy, I took a course on cybersecurity. And it was during that time of that course that my eyes were open to really all of the avenues of attack that nefarious actors have available to them in trying to access data from both a private and public arena. So criminal justice agencies are not immune to attack from nefarious actors. And so having my eyes open to that, in December of 2022, we were able to recognize that the most recent CJIS security policy, and that was version 5.9.2, introduced a new portion that now requires agencies to ensure the integrity of the firmware on all of their devices, as well as any network appliances that either view, store, house, or transmit or process criminal justice information. That new requirement for firmware integrity was auditable by the Advisory Policy Board that we discussed earlier as of October of 2023. So this is a requirement that was first introduced at the end of 2022, and agencies are responsible for as of October of last year. And so here, as we speak in September of 2024, there has been, in my opinion, there has been a sufficient time lapse where agencies, if they haven't already been seeking out a solution to meet firmware integrity, they certainly should be that by this point. Panasonic was introduced to a company called Eclypsium, and Panasonic and Eclypsium formed a strategic partnership. In that strategic partnership, we recognized that Eclypsium is the only independent software vendor that we could find on the market that meets all of the requirements of firmware integrity as outlined by the CJIS security policy. Now, CJIS security policy 5.9.2 was 2 versions ago. Presently, we're up to 5.9.5. Excuse me, that's 3 versions ago. So that's how the CJIS security policy has been evolving, and Eclypsium is here to help us meet that requirement of firmware integrity. Now, Wes, he's certainly our subject matter expert. I don't want to begin to describe how they meet that requirement, but I think you should probably ask Wes how they do that, and he can give you a good technical answer.
Well, I think Sean just asked the question for me. So how about letting us know just exactly how the service ends up simplifying the firmware integrity checks and the asset validation?
Yep. Yeah. And when we think of firmware on a device, firmware can take a number of different terminologies. First off, if we think about your typical laptop or desktop, and firmware is really the code that makes everything run. It's how the operating system interfaces with the hardware itself. And what we're finding is that this software that's running the actual hardware itself is ultimately the largest target now for bad actors. And we're finding that they're moving down the stack into this area to remain persistent, to have capabilities of doing data destruction, and ultimately to evade other controls. So we help to focus to really ascertain, is that firmware what it says it is? Did it come from the manufacturer as it sits, as well as looking at it from a risk and threat perspective? Does it harbor anything dangerous? And does it contain anything that would be risky to the organization? Things like vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. Now, also as part of the CJIS control reference, which is SI 7 around software, firmware, and information integrity, is also really around monitoring this for change. One of the types of tactics that an attacker could use would be doing something like changing a version number within a piece of firmware and apply it to a system so that it has a vulnerability but makes it appear as if it's newer. And in those types of situations, we actually track that the firmware itself is still changed regardless of what it's reporting to the operating system. So when we look at it from the CJIS controls perspective, we ultimately help these organizations to track this stuff on each one of their devices across their entire enterprise at a granular scale by effectively inspection of every piece of firmware. Now, that's on the desktop and server side of things. When we start talking about things like network devices, so switches, routers, firewalls, load balancers, those types of things, firmware takes a slightly different terminology. Firmware in that place can be the entire running operating system on that device. And in those kinds of cases, we work to inspect those devices remotely, to fingerprint them, and ultimately do the same levels of checks to ascertain, are there any threats within them? Does it match with what the manufacturer shipped to indicate if there's been any firmware or hardware tampering on it? And ultimately to ensure that that device maintains the integrity, to ensure that the data processing through it is actually valid and compliant as well.
Now, say there is an issue for whatever reason. Like you said, it could be a bad actor, or it could be just somebody mistyping a keystroke, or something happens and something has gone awry. is the Eclypsium solution something that monitors and then identifies and communicates that over to the law enforcement agency for quick resolution?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're thinking of is effectively a detect and respond kind of methodology, where we absolutely are the platform that performs that monitoring. And then if something is detected, something that doesn't match with what it should be, or if we find new vulnerabilities or risks that are presented to the organization, we integrate directly with their other technologies that they're already using. So things like seams and source solutions, so that they can go and have aggregation of these sources of events and alerts that we generate in the same processes that they're doing with other things. Like if somebody types a bad password, or, if somebody's hammering an external firewall. We want to feed into the existing workflows and processes that organizations are already using, so that then they can respond in kind. Now, in the case of something like a device tampering, if we find out that a device has had an attack against it, in those situations, obviously the first remediation to it is isolating the device and then collecting it and doing forensics upon it, which we help organizations to do as well.
And Sean, let me go back to you on this. How valuable is a tool like this to a law enforcement agency, like in your career at the Pennsylvania State Police?
Oh, extremely valuable. Law enforcement agencies, although we have access to the best worldwide experts in most things information technology, agencies are limited in the resources that they can focus on any one particular topic. So oftentimes by utilizing an outside vendor such as Eclypsium, or in this case, Panasonic Smart Compliance, you're utilizing the best technology available without having to have that subject matter expertise to implement it. So, in other words, law enforcement always has to have access to what I'll just say theoretically is the best. But having access to it and knowing how to implement it are two different topics. And so, by utilizing a product such as Eclypsium that allows agencies to have that peace of mind to ensure that they have firmware integrity and that there are no unauthorized changes to their firmware without having to have a deep expertise into how the mechanics of it work is invaluable.
So, Wes, how challenging is it for an agency to implement the Eclypsium solution?
It's actually very simple. The approach that we take is that we just collect information from the device itself through a piece of software. So if a customer can perform something like a update to their Office applications or their CJIS application through remote software deployment mechanisms, that's all this more difficult it is to deploy our stuff. And effectively, you would deploy this, what we call a sensor, to the device, and then the sensor silently starts collecting information. That information traverses to our system, where we then do the analysis of everything collected from the device. And this goes into where we start doing some real deep inspection of those firmware pieces, looking for those threats, looking for known and unknown vulnerabilities in it. So down to including things like 0 days that may exist on the device, or, things that have never been discovered before. And then ultimately from that point, it's really about when we find things that are pertinent information, that gets communicated automatically back to the customer so that they can prioritize what's important to them to fix and reduce their risk profile.
And so obviously this is something that, law enforcement agencies should look to have, particularly if they're procuring new equipment. But it sounds like whether, it's on a new system or on an existing system, it doesn't seem very difficult for it to come into play and start working immediately, right?
That's correct. It's absolutely correct. And that's one of the things is, whether it's a new system or things that are already deployed, both need to be inspected, one, to build trust in that device first off, but then also to regularly reinspect, especially in the case of something like a CJIS device that may be exposed to the public. Now, I always like to think of it from an aspect of we're all guilty of this. We buy the newest piece of technology, and first thing we do is we rip the plastic off of it and connect it to our wireless networks and provision it and start using it. And, organizations do this too. They might do it a little differently by putting their own operating system on it or things like that. But the largest piece of actually building trust in that device that they're using is skipped. And that's the piece that we fill out and add into the process here, where we can allow them to actually trust that device before they ever connect it to their enterprise systems.
Wes, I often hear that referred to, and even through your literature, as supply chain security. And I know oftentimes when I'm discussing it with agencies, they seem confused by that. Can you expand upon that for our audience so they understand a little bit better by what Eclypsium means with supply chain security?
Yeah, there's really two predominant aspects of supply chain security. And the one is what I'll call is the physical supply chain. This is the more legacy mentality of what supply chain entails. Is you think of trucks and you think of logistics, where that device changes physical hands over time. And, when we buy a device, like I'll just use a laptop as an example, that thing comes from about 300 different factories and changes hands a bunch of times. And it largely goes from warehouse to warehouse and gets moved around. And then it ends up on your dock where it sits for, a period of time before getting deployed. And ultimately, at every single one of those stages, there's opportunity for something bad to happen to that device, whether it be, some kid that wants to, make a name for himself, or it could be something like a nation state actor that is really trying to get information out of your organization. Now, the other side of the equation is that bad actors have started to move up to our suppliers to try to find easier ways into our organizations. We could have the best of breed technologies, but if, I'm buying a device from a certain manufacturer, they could actually go attack that manufacturer and get embedded into things like their firmware release processes. And then when that gets published on their support site and gets deployed out onto millions of devices out there, that could largely be trusted because everyone already trusts that name on that, laptop, for example. Now, in that scenario, we can go and provide both the validation of, yes, that is the firmware that came from them, but also that cursory check of, is there anything dangerous within this? So this is really where it comes into the compelling piece of identifying, is something dangerous to my organization, and is this something that I should trust? And both of those go back to your point of, this is really what we do to protect against supply chain threats.
And a lot of people don't realize that. You really made a good point. How many different places is that device before it actually ends up in your hands? And most people don't even realize, too, that the largest data breaches that have happened recently didn't start with the big entity that ended up being the problem, like we'll say Ticketmaster, for example, just to give something outside of law enforcement. But the Ticketmaster data breach, that didn't come from Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster wasn't hacked. It was one of their smaller companies that feeds data into Ticketmaster that was attacked, because smaller companies don't have the same type of cybersecurity that the larger entities have. So when you think about that and you think about how many different places has that been, I mean, if it's getting shipped by UPS and it sits on a loading dock or sits in a warehouse, how many people would have access to that? Or if it goes to, a shared space, a building that has a loading dock, how many of them actually have access control on their warehouse? And so you have to really think that, like you said, that ripple effect, it's going to start somewhere small where it seems innocuous that something could have happened, but it's going to lead to a bigger problem down the line, because that ripple effect is going to cause waves.
Yeah, Rick, that's a very good point. And just to underline what Wes is saying about the supply chain, in the news as of this recording, there's a very well-known cybersecurity organization that discovered they had employed a nation-state actor who infiltrated their organization under false pretenses. And so, to Wes's point, to have an entity such as Eclypsium ensuring that the firmware on a device, a network, a server, an appliance has not had any unauthorized changes is most paramount because one can never know where the threat may be found. We'll use an example again. The governor of New York, most recently in the news, it was discovered that a nation state actor was on her staff, unbeknownst to her. And so, nation state actors and even employees who make mistakes or may have unaltruistic motivations have access to our systems. And so, there needs to be a check and balance in place, such as smart compliance, powered by Eclypsium, to ensure that your firmware does remain with its integrity intact and does not have any unauthorized changes to it.
Sean, I'll bring an even different example here as well. Years ago, there was a major scenario where people were buying network switches off of eBay or Amazon, and they were buying big name brand switches. And when they would get them, they would look exactly like the packaging, and they were shrink wrapped and everything like that. And then they'd have an issue a year down the line with that switch and it was working perfectly fine for them. And they would call the support line for this manufacturer. And the manufacturer would say, hey, that device isn't actually under support because it's not a genuine device. And these companies were running for long periods of time with actually counterfeit equipment. So this is another key piece, is validating that equipment is actually genuine and is what it says it is another key part of supply chain security.
Boy, I could see why the FBI CJIS division has placed such an emphasis, or rather the APB has placed such an emphasis on firmware integrity as far as criminal justice information is concerned. I mean, that's a very good example. Thanks, Wes.
Yeah, and I've got one more for you guys as well. And when we think about, I'll say, the pervasiveness of ransomware attacks against organization, we end up in scenarios where occasionally these organizations, these bad actor groups, target some big names, and they end up in scenarios where they do get a piece of ransomware inside of a large organization that is very well trusted, for example. And this has happened a lot, and you can find this in the news on generally about a monthly basis of a large organization that creates or manufactures consumer electronics. In those cases, instead of just holding the data at ransom, they actually exfiltrate the data and oftentimes end up with things like code signing keys and things like that, where now this bad actor group can sign software as that company and distribute it. So we actually have been tracking a number of things like signing keys that have been leaked as of recently. And these are things that we can't revoke out there in the industry because so many millions of devices rely on these keys on a regular basis to sign software that's running on them. So these unfortunately leaked keys have to remain trusted. Otherwise, we end up bricking millions of devices. So in those scenarios, if I were a bad guy, I could take these keys, sign my own software, and send something to a target of mine, and then execute an attack with trusted and validated things that our systems are already designed to trust. So this will end up being in a scenario where it'll bypass the security controls that you already have because it says it's actually good. So now we're in scenarios where we can't even trust the things that we're supposed to be trusting.
And that is daunting. I would have to say that particularly when you're thinking about law enforcement and everything that could be contained within those systems, that would keep me up at night. Sean, I think we know why. I think we know why you retired.
Well, it's a good thing to be in what we call the 3 checks of the month club.
That is absolutely the case. But again, I think it is well worth the peace of mind that these organizations are going to get to really look at this smart compliance service powered by Eclypsium and make sure that it is running on their Panasonic Connect devices, because as we've said, the alternatives are not something that you really think about, or that you want to think about, or that you want to face. And particularly when it comes to that audit process, you want to make sure that you've got everything in order.
Well, Rick, I think it needs to be stated, and it would be my fault for not stating it earlier. We don't want to give anyone the impression that Eclypsium is limited to solely Panasonic devices. Eclypsium is device agnostic. So that way you could actually purchase the product from Panasonic to be used on your non-Panasonic devices. This is important because although Panasonic, we believe, has the best ruggedized devices for use by criminal justice agencies and non-criminal justice agencies in the public sector, we're not the only ruggedized devices available in the marketplace. That being said, it is important that no matter what device clients are using, that they have to ensure that their data is protected. And smart compliance powered by Eclypsium is one of the mechanisms that they can use to protect that data.
Wes, any final thoughts?
I don't think I could have said it better than Sean. And I just wanted to go and say thank you all for taking the time to listen. And if you, of course, have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Sean. We'll be happy to answer any of them.
No, we appreciate that. And this is why we really do value the partnership that we have with Panasonic Connect and its strategic partners like Eclypsium. Because if there are any questions, there's any concern, all you have to do is pick up the phone or send an email to your DALY representative, and we will be happy to put you in touch with Sean and Wes, and they can walk you through all of this. Gents, thanks so much for joining the Technology Pulse. This has been an absolutely amazing episode, and I look forward to talking to you again because, as we've said, the CJIS policy is constantly evolving because cybersecurity is constantly evolving. It's a journey, not a destination. And so there's always going to be something new. So can't wait to hear what you have for us the next time.
And that wraps up another insightful episode of the Daily Technology Pulse podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Before we sign off, we want to take a moment to remind you of some important legal considerations. The views and opinions expressed by guests on the Daily Technology Pulse podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Daily Computers or its partners. The content provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as professional advice. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means without the prior written permission of Daily Computers Inc. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us. You can find us at www.daly.com. The Daily Technology Pulse podcast will be back with more exciting discussions on the latest in technology. Until next time, stay curious and stay connected.